Welcome, everybody, to this week's session of the Peace Research Colloquium hosted by Swiss Peace and the Graduate School of Social Sciences at the University of Basel. It's a great pleasure to see so many people here, and especially to welcome our speaker, Jessie Barton-Hronešová from the University of Oxford. My name is Dana Landau, and as I mentioned, first of all, I will just do very quickly a couple of housekeeping rules, and then I will introduce our speaker and hand over to her for today's presentation. So in terms of housekeeping, as I already mentioned, for the early arrivers, we try to have a sort of friendly colloquium atmosphere here. So even though we cannot be together in the same place, if you have a good enough internet connection, do switch on your camera so we can see each other's reactions, but keep yourself on mute during the presentation. Afterwards, there will be a chance to discuss and have questions answered by our guest speaker. So for the discussion, it would be great if you either write your questions into the chat box, which you can find at the bottom, or use the raise hand function, and I will moderate and make sure as many of you as possible get to ask their questions. So now, without much further ado, I'm really pleased to welcome Jessie Barton-Hronešová, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the Oxford Department for International Development, and will today be presenting her book called The Struggle for Redress, Victim Capital in Bosnia and Herzegovina. This book is the result of many years of research, which she conducted during her postdoctoral time, also at, her doctoral research, of course, conducted at the Department of Politics and International Relations of the University of Oxford. I've also just found out that on her many list of achievements today, I think today or yesterday, Jessie, a new one has been added, which is that she is the newly appointed Associate Fellow for the Balkans at Chatham House. So it is our great pleasure to welcome you. We will hear about your book now for about half an hour, and afterwards we'll have time to discuss. Today's session will be a little bit shorter than usual, so we'll probably finish around 5:30. But I hand over to you, Jessie. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Dana. And let me just try to share my screen with you. There we go. Does that look all right to everyone?
Yes.
Perfect. Thanks so much for the invitation, and thank you everyone for being here and taking, maybe for some of you, taking a break from the nerve-wracking US elections, which everyone's probably following right now. We're still hoping for Biden win, but we'll see. But let me take you now to a different part of the world and talk a little bit about a country that to some of you might seem completely over-researched, to some of you might be completely new, and a new case study that you do not know that much about. But I want to take you to the former Yugoslavia, to Bosnia and Herzegovina, and talk about a research that, as Dana said, I have been conducting for many years now, both as a scholar as well as a practitioner working in the field of transitional justice. And the result of this research is this book that is called The Struggle for Redress, Victim Capital in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Let me talk you through some of the main arguments, a little bit on methodology, and then at the end, if we've got time, talk you through one of the mini case studies that is included in the book. But obviously, it's just a flavor of all the different arguments that are included in this research. But I hope to convince you that if there's one thing that you need to know about the struggle for redress in Bosnia, is that victims' agency is extremely important, and victims actually do have a sway in how victim-related policies regarding transitional justice actually go in post-war countries. And that has been the main objective of this research. So why did I actually decide to study victims and redress in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and why did I think it was important? I adopted a grounded theory approach. As I said, I worked in Bosnia for many years prior to my doctoral research, and I was also working at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. And I noticed that there has been really a little bit of an obsession regarding transitional justice, especially court proceedings and the legal side of transitional justice in Bosnia. Some people call it an obsession with that, ever since the war has ended in 1995. Obviously, Bosnia was a bit of a trailblazer in establishing international criminal prosecution and has really led way, or the international community has led way in prosecuting some of the key cases from the former Yugoslav conflict and the Bosnian conflict. Within that, victims have really been thought of as a bit of an afterthought. They played a role as witnesses. They were giving their testimonies in trials, but they really were not the main beneficiaries, if you like, or considered as the main beneficiaries of transitional justice, despite some of the rhetorics around the policies that were being adopted. However, when I was working and researching this wider field in Bosnia, I realized that actually the victim associations and the victim groups that exist are quite prominent on the media scene. They're quite prominent in even politics in the country. And really, if you open any Bosnian media any day of the year, it does seem that the war really is not dead. It's still there. And victim associations do comment on pretty much anything and everything happening in the country. And so the question that I started asking myself was, how do victims then influence post-war reconstruction in Bosnia? Do they actually have any sway? And in particular, what have been their main aims and have they achieved them regarding transitional justice? So in a way, what is it that they demanded the most? Was it really trials? And how did they go about achieving it? And the answers that I have found through this grounded theory approach was, well, trials are certainly very important, and so is truth and memorialization, all of those. But what started coming out at the start of my research, which, if I take you back, is around the year of 2012, 2013, it is redress. It is a series of symbolic as well as material policies that they simply have not really seen materializing in the way that victims would have hoped. Trials were in a way still happening. They were not happy about them. But the one missing piece that they really were constantly, time and again in my interviews mentioning is there is no recognition of our suffering. There is no redress for some cases. In other cases, that has really happened. And when I started studying different victim groups that I'm going to talk about today, I realized that there seemed to be quite a piecemeal approach to how this redress has been adopted in Bosnia, basically who has benefited from redress and who hasn't. And I started asking the question, right, so how do we actually explain who has been redressed, if you like, and who hasn't? What is in a way the in-country variation between these groups, and how do we explain it? And that has been the main research question, as well as the research puzzle of what I have been looking at. I should also say that redress in the Bosnian case is often also called a so-called status, which is like a legal recognition in law. An individual and a group of victims is considered as being victimized by a certain crime, event, set of affairs that then make them eligible to a set of benefits. And this quest for status, this struggle for status, has really been at the heart of a lot of these victim movements that I have been studying. So if we study Bosnian victims, as I said, this whole research started as a doctoral project, and because of the over-researched nature of the country in many respects, I had to branch out of the over-researched parts of the country, which is mainly the urban parts of the country, which has led me to quite a lot of the rural regions of Bosnia, which are on this map, outside of the capital Sarajevo, outside of the main city in Republika Srpska, Banja Luka, outside of the main Croat city in Herzegovina, or Split city, not Croat city, but the main city in Herzegovina, Mostar. And that led me to a series of trips lasting from 2 weeks to 3 months across the country, and conducting over 135 interviews in the period between 2013 to just before the pandemic basically started, just before Christmas. 2019. I mainly interviewed victim associations, NGOs, civil society, journalists, as well as politicians, international representatives of international organizations. And obviously I participated in a series of cultural events, memorializations, mass burials, and the like. So it was very much, as I said, a grounded approach to understanding how do we actually explain the adoption of redress policies in the country. I should also note that it was extremely difficult to get reliable statistical data on, what is the size of the population that we're talking about, how many of the victims that I'm looking at are still surviving. It's a really sad story, but obviously 25 years after the end of the war, this population is diminishing. And so from one year to another, we're talking about different numbers, and that has a huge bearing on social policies, and that has a huge bearing on victim-related policies. But if any one of you was ever to study, similar populations, I must say that the work of journalists and various transitional justice organizations has been an invaluable resource of local data that one can then put together and get a wider picture of how many people we're actually talking about. So some of the numbers that we do have with some reliability, the standard data is about the death toll during the war, how many people actually died. We can see the clear skewness towards the Bosnian Muslim/Bosniak population. And we can also, that's the graph on the left. In the blue, you see the clear disparity in the numbers. The Bosniaks are the highest number of the total, around 100,000 people that were killed during the war, out of a population, pre-war population of over 4 million people. The next figure shows you how the death toll was also skewed by gender. So if you look at the yellow columns, you can see that those were men that died during the war. So it was mainly males that died during the war, which leaves you with surviving victims, and the surviving population that I am looking at being mainly predominantly women, which explains why a lot of these organizations and movements are led by women. So there's a gender dynamics in this as well, for obvious reasons. So here I've also included some of the other statistics that we've got. We've got fairly reliable statistics on the numbers of missing people, both in the region of the former Yugoslavia as well as in Bosnia, thanks to the work of the International Commission for Missing People. Over 32,000 people initially missing. Obviously, over 75% of them have been found, which is an unprecedented success worldwide. And again, the skewness is mainly towards males going missing and predominantly Bosniak Muslims. And obviously, disappearances are directly linked to crimes. So that tells you already quite a lot about the course of the conflict and about the victimization and criminalization of the war. In terms of the other numbers, victims of sexual violence, we don't really have reliable data for, again, quite obvious reasons. Many women would, and men as well, because we also had male victims of sexual violence, would not want to come out and talk about their traumas. Some of them would have left the country, fled the country. Many of them were also killed. So we really do not have reliable data on this, but the number that's usually being mentioned is in the realm of 20,000. Similar situation with victims of torture, around 150,000 across the country. And then more reliable data that we have is on the number of disabled people and severely injured people, around 200,000. And if we think about the size of the country, which is, pre-war, as I said, over 4 million, now we're looking at probably less than 3.2 million. That's the latest statistics we have. Those are quite high numbers. So that leads you to conclude that, there's probably not a single family or extended family that would not have been affected in one way or another by victimization, which obviously has consequences for any type of redress policies any state would want to adopt. So what are the studied groups that I was actually looking at beyond these numbers? So I've already hinted to some of them, such as the families of missing persons. So direct victims would be missing persons, and those that are surviving that would be eligible to some sort of redress, to some sort of support, to some sort of acknowledgement and recognition of their suffering would obviously be their relatives, their families. So after all the research, all the field work, I basically focused on 5 key victim groups that play an important role in Bosnia. The first one I call military war victims, and I'd leave this for the Q&A because that would need a 5-minute explanation to how I designed these and why these are included. But suffice to say that you simply can't leave them out if you want to have the full variation of victimization in the country. I would have a very skewed research if I didn't really include them. And their victimization is defined by physical injuries, disabilities, and those are also families of killed soldiers. The equivalent of that within the civilian population is so-called civilian war victims. It's a strange term, but it's being used in Bosnia as a catch-all phrase for, again, physical injuries, disability, and families of killed people. So families of missing persons, as well as victims of torture, for example, do not per se belong to civilian war victims as such. So the next one I already mentioned, families of the missing, and then the last two that I was looking at were victims of torture, so individuals that were tortured in the multitude of camps, detention camps across Bosnia, and the last group separate victims of sexual violence. All of these associations, all of these groups, as you can see in this table, have somehow gathered and organized themselves in victim associations at various levels of the state administration, mainly unionized themselves as any other unions would at the so-called entity levels, because Bosnia is split between two entities, and then an internationally or initially internationally run independent multinational district. And I have also mentioned on the right-hand column the types of recognition that these groups pertain to. So entity laws means the subnational laws that were adopted. State law are laws that pertain to all the groups across the country, no matter what the region is. And some of those have, as you can see, some of those have expired. Some of those are only applicable in one part of the country, not in the other. And so my puzzle basically was, right, so how do we explain this variation? Why are some of these, redressed in one, why is there a redress policy for some of these groups in one part of the country? Why is it sometimes at the state level and so on? What does it, how do we actually explain this? Here is a table, apologies for the blurriness, but here's a table that then gives you the exact laws and then tells you, what the groups actually demanded and what they actually achieved. So I just want to draw attention to number 4, victims of torture, who have across the country, in particular in the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, demanded a state-level law and so far have failed. In 2018, only in the smaller part of the country, in Republika Srpska, the Bosnian Serb-dominated country, was a new law adopted for this group. And when I say that, I mean that as a victim of torture in the Federation, in the country, you basically do not have any special rights. You're not recognized as a victim of war as such. Whereas in Republika Srpska, as of 2018, you are. And so, think about the 25 years that have passed and how many of those individuals are no longer with us. On the other hand, for example, families of missing people, as you can see in number 3, were successful in having a state law adopted, which is completely unprecedented in the quite divided Bosnian state, that there would be a victim-centric law adopted at the state level. So there would be an agreement on that, no matter what the ethnicity, no matter what the region, the law would apply to all. I won't talk much about the implementation, which has been extremely poor and extremely bad for a set of very similar reasons that I will be talking about. However, that wasn't really my focus, and I should highlight that. My focus was mainly how do these laws get adopted? Where do we find the willingness in the first place to get them adopted, rather than to have them implemented? The implementation I do talk about in the book, but I do not explain in the conceptual model that I will present to you today. So just really quickly, what are the existing explanations? You have listened to this and, probably a few explanations came to your mind being like, oh, it's all down to financial resources. It's all down to the levels of democracy in the country and the likes. And so the existing explanations, some of which that I just mentioned, mainly focus on differences between countries, between different states. Only a minority of them would actually be able to explain differences within a country and between groups. So the first one that, redress might be a side effect of trials or the various structural determinants such as pluralism or democracy of the country. That's all great, but that usually applies to the state level, that different states simply have different policies. But it does not explain the differences between the group, the subnational variations that I was looking at. Peace-building explanations often tell us that it's simply, the priorities of international peace builders, and that peace builders can impose certain policies, and that's why we can see these variations. Again, that can explain parts of what I'm looking at, but it doesn't give us the full variation. Comparative politics, and especially distributive politics and studies in nationalism and ethnic identities, usually argue that it's all down to, ethnic identity prioritization, that one group would simply adopt laws for their own and recognize their own. Again, again, we see those patterns across the world, including Bosnia, but that, for example, does not explain why missing people have had a state-level law adopted. The next set of explanation tells us that it's all down to transnational advocacy framework networks and the diffusion of global norms of justice and redress. Again, those do tend to give us parts of the explanations. In the case of Bosnia, for example, victims of sexual violence were definitely benefiting from various advocates that were advocating on their behalf in the country. But again, it does not tell us why is there so much variety. And lastly, social mobilization theories would simply tell us, oh, it's all down to, how powerful and strong the various groups are and how much they lobby and how much they protest and, what the tools that they have that they use are and that they basically act like pressure groups that would explain this to us. And again, I see parts of that argument certainly playing out in Bosnia as well as other countries, but it does not provide the full variation that I'm looking at. So my task in this book was to provide a full explanation that would be actually able to bring all of these together, build on them, but actually use the empirical material to tell us, well, there's actually a lot more happening here. So that leads me to the title of the book and the idea of victim capital, which is the main argument. And basically the main argument runs as follows. The social, political, and economic power of leverage and influence that is attributed, not necessarily that they have, but that is attributed to each of the studying victim groups can explain to us how, why, and what was the pathways of their redress adoption policies. And when I talk about victim capital, I talk about three main components that victim capital has. The first one is moral authority, second one is mobilization resources, and the third one is international salience, which I will talk about in a moment. But obviously these three components are building on the literature that I just mentioned. And so the argument that runs that victims' redress is mainly the outcome of whether or not leaders of victim groups are able to leverage these three components of their victim capital and convince domestic political authorities and potentially sometimes international actors that redress is in their political, social, and economic or even reputational interest. So it's not necessarily just a pragmatist explanation. Norms and values do play a role. So just really quickly, what is moral authority? It's extensively covered from anywhere of memory studies, literature to symbolic politics and the likes. It's basically the public recognition, the wider domestic public recognition that a group has the right to be redressed. And one can study it through coverage in domestic media, through reporting, through campaigns, through cultural scenes and the like. One can look at it as basically the deservingness of a victim group. Sometimes we talk about in the criminologist literature, we talk about clean hand victims and ideal victims, pure victims and the likes, which are usually portrayed as the most deserving of any type of transitional justice policy, including redress. To moral authority also depends what I was talking about when I was talking about distributive politics. So the ethnic identity, the identity properties of a group, and symbolic politics. So obviously, yes, we do see that happening, that there will be prioritization of ethnic identities in the distribution of these policies. And we also see these ideas of the beacons of suffering, which is very related to the deservingness, that some victim groups are, one could call it hijacked by political authorities as being the representatives of the wider suffering of a group, nation, a country, state, region, crime, and the like. International salience again builds on some of the peace building and the human rights literature, is basically the amount of international attention that a group has, or the attention to the demands that it has. One can study it in the advances of the protection of human rights, UN conventions and resolutions, international court decisions. One can study it about the dominant, in a way, trendy topics of the day on the global humanitarian and human rights scene. One can study it through peace-building projects and priorities on the ground as well as internationally. And one can study it through looking at international media coverage, so-called CNN effect, which I talk about in the book as well regarding some of these groups. And finally, mobilization resources, which I built on using the new social movements literature, are basically the endowments that are controlled, the social mobilization endowments controlled by a group, but they can expand them, they can diminish them. It's not only the membership of the group, it's and the associations, it's the networks, the allies, the financial and informational resources. One could, in today's age, one could argue about IT resources, the ability to campaign online, use social media and the likes. And it's the capacities, the various capacities of the leadership. And that then brings us to the ability, obviously, to protest, to organize campaigns, to mobilize themselves, and to challenge domestic authorities on the policies that they are prioritizing or putting through the parliaments. So the argument that I am offering in this book is that there is no one recipe for success in terms of what type of victim capital a group has to have. What I'm doing in the book is I'm looking and process tracing the various groups, the 5 key groups that I told you about, and I'm looking at their achievements across those 25 years and looking at what they achieved and saying why, using this concept of victim capital and basically tracing the 3 main components and how they have developed across those 25 years or 24 years, as I basically finished writing the book at the end of 2019. Beyond that, one should obviously argue that structural determinants matter. They matter hugely across time. Bosnia went through different periods of extensive peace building, limited peace building, more EU involvement and the like. So all of this is then context dependent, and economic development matters as well. Budgets matter as well. Financial resources matter as well. And as I said, the role of international actors matters as well. And I build that into the arguments basically on the case studies when I'm tracing the developments. There have been various windows of opportunity in the country when more policies were able to be adopted. Sometimes victims have acted upon those windows of opportunity. Sometimes they haven't, which again explains to us how they've mobilized themselves and how they've leveraged their victim capital, when and why. And so then the argument goes that domestic authorities would be at specific times and places more sensitive to political, reputational, and economic costs. So if, for example, they're seeking more external funding or the admission to international organizations, they might listen more to international actors at those times than at other times. So let me now bring you just to a mini case study that I have included, that is basically one of the chapters in the book. What I do in the book is I combine usually 2 groups together, with the exception of missing people, and side by side compare them and tell you why one has been successful and the other one hasn't been really that successful. But here, what I just want to talk you through real quickly is how victim capital has panned out for the victims of sexual violence, which in 2006 have seen a new law amendment being basically recognized as a specific group of victims, survivors. Let's maybe talk about Q&A why I'm using the term victims rather than victim survivors or survivors. There's a huge literature on this in obviously the feminist literature. And it is included in the book as well, the discussion of that. And so in 2006, they were recognized in the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina as a specific victim group with a set of policies and rights attached to them. And that was a huge success, which basically remains unprecedented in the other part of the country, in Republika Srpska, for various reasons. Mainly, the plain one is that most of the victims were actually or are residing in the Federation. So the moral authority of this group was initially during the war quite high. There's this famous quote from the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Bosnia saying that Bosnia is being gang raped, and using the reports of rape as in a way to trying to entice the international community in intervening in Bosnia in the conflict. But right after the war, the stigma of the rape, the silence around it, and all of that has led to the fact that moral authority was very, very low. And basically I should say male were also sexually violated during the war. There were hundreds of them. However, the dominant part of this group were females. And so after the war, the moral authority was very low. However, through the work of NGOs as well as victim associations, that has actually been built up to this idea of women being symbols of purity and motherhood, and Bosnia standing, as in other countries, this is well known from the US as well, as basically females standing for the mothers of the nation and sacrificing their bodies for the state. So their moral authority has gradually grown. Mobilization resources have also grown. Initially, as I said, women were really not part of the wider agenda. They organized themselves in associations of victims of torture. But by 2003, a very active female survivor set up an organization called Women Victims of War, and under her very strong leadership, started lobbying, protesting, campaigning, mobilizing people, and really gathering a set of allies around her, and creating much more attention to this issue than previously, which then in 2006, when she gained an important ally in the form of an NGO in Zenica that was working with a filmmaker that made a famous film that then won an international award and led to a nationwide campaign, and really really changed the opinion of the Bosnian public in terms of whether women should pertain to a special law or whether they should be recognized and so on. And that in 2006 directly preceded the law amendment. And when the law amendment was actually passed, these women were protesting in front of the parliament. But all of this was happening also at a time when really we started focusing, we meaning the wider international research community, peace-building community, started focusing a lot more on women as distinct actors in wars with a set of new plights and so on. Just recently, we celebrated 20 years of the 1325 resolution, UN resolution. We have seen the ICTY, the International Criminal for Former Yugoslavia, cases that have made path-breaking decisions on defining rape as a war crime, a crime against humanity. And we've seen a rising global awareness of these issues and the setup of, for example, the Organization of UN Women as a special UN branch. And much later, after all of this was passed, this effect of international salience kept going with people like Angelina Jolie coming to Bosnia and raising awareness with the British Foreign Office about this issue. And so what I'm doing in this particular mini case study, I'm basically tracing the developments and saying, 2006 was in a way a window of opportunity when peace building was quite prominent in the country, when local policymakers were listening to all of these developments. The moral authority of women has grown and their mobilization resources were quite high. And all of that has led to the quite path-breaking change, one could argue. And so to conclude, I hope I'm not too late, but to conclude, the main message of the book is, as evidenced on this particular case study, is that victims really are not passive recipients of the transitional justice measures, as sometimes the peace-building literature would argue, but they are protagonists of transitional justice, which I think is increasingly being recognized in the wider literature. And mainly, I'm using this idea of victim capital, that is really what they can leverage within limits, within structural constraints of a state, within limits of financial resources and the likes. But they are not the passive actors that we have thought of them about in the past. And this then boils me to my interest currently, which is the idea of the politics of victimhood, because through this research, and as the book also tries to argue, one could also see how over the years across the world, victims become political actors in their own right, not only social actors, but political actors. On the one hand, they're being manipulated by the let's say, political parties, be it on the ethnic grounds or any other corrupt grounds, if you like. But at the same time, they do engage in politics themselves. It's not only that politics engages with them, they also engage in politics. A lot of the victim leaders in Bosnia, for example, are very close to the main nationalist parties. Some of them were even founding members of the nationalist parties. And the other way how they basically become part of the wider politics of victimhood is that obviously the more they argue for their own case, the more they argue for redress of one particular group over another, they add on to this polarization of post-war, of a post-conflict society that in the case of Bosnia is extremely fragmented, and which is why it is a very good case to study the fragmentation of victim communities. And that is, again, covered in the wider, even historical literature on victimhood regarding the ideas of competitive victimhood, when different groups argue over who's a higher and bigger victim over the others, and as well as the various privileges that stem from this status, from this recognition of being a victim, because obviously in a country like Bosnia that is still economically depleted or underdeveloped, if you like, the pot that victims can draw from is limited, so there will be competition over who gets what, and that in a way diminishes the value, the symbolic value of redress as a set of recognition tools for those that have suffered the most in wars. So finally, let me just conclude that I just want to reiterate that there is no singular pathways to obtaining redress, is the conclusion. However, there is equifinality in terms of how victim capital plays out. So there are different combinations of the components that I was talking about to achieve redress. And really, it's very interesting, and in different case studies, in the case of Peru, in the case of Colombia, in the case of Northern Ireland, how different victim groups organize themselves and how they actually use and leverage these various types of capital that they have. Some of them choose not to for various reasons. Some of them choose to go even a step further and engage themselves directly in politics and leverage their victim capital as much as they can. And I'll leave it there and look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Jessie Barton-Hronešová, for sharing your really fascinating research with us. Yes, there are these virtual ways of reacting. I'm sure we will get the sentiment also in the questions. So I have a lot of questions, but I will not abuse my position. I will invite all of you to either use the raise hand function, which you can find if you press on participants at the bottom, or to write your question in the chat. I see a raised hand by Leandra. And then when you can unmute yourself if I call on you.
Okay, that was quick. Thank you very much, Jessie, and lovely to see you in this format again. I also have a lot of questions, but I'm only going to ask one and then see if I have time for more. And I think it relates already to what you mentioned at the very end, that some of the victim groups decide not to use a certain potential. So I was wondering whether you saw a difference between, because you said with moral authority, these are things that are attributed to them, right? It's not something that is chosen. So do you see a conflict sometimes between this attribution and their self-description or self-identification, and perhaps not only with regards to the group of victims of sexual violence, but if you could tell us about the others, that would be really interesting. Thank you.
Dana, do you want me to respond direct, or do you want to gather a few?
Maybe we'll gather one more question and then you can respond to both of them. So Sanjay, just unmute yourself. Yeah.
Thank you, Dana, for giving me the opportunity. Congratulations, Jessie, for your great work. My question is actually, I have been closely working with the LTT issue in Sri Lanka. Mm-hmm. And while working on the field with the missing people, where the structural violence is very high, and we noticed that after the constitution of Truth and Justice project, still the missing person redress is a failure, and people are not at all achieved anything with the reconciliation after in the name of transitional justice. So my question is, I mean, in your case, the missing person category is a success you have indicated. So how do you measure that success? What are the indicators of your success for the missing persons where you worked on?
Thanks so much for the great questions. So, Leandra, on your first one, the attribution and self-identification. So that's a brilliant one, and I will actually use the example of the survivors of sexual or victims of sexual violence, and this is actually what it boils down to. So, as you know, working on these issues, the term survivor is generally preferred to the term victim regarding sexual violence, mainly because it. When I say preferred, I mean both by researchers as well as a lot of victims that we study, a lot of the actual survivors that we study. The reason for that is that the term survivor encapsulates agency, life after, and so on, whereas the term victim is extremely passive. And although my argument is about victims not being passive, that is usually the perception of these two terms. And the interesting one is why, for example, the organization for gathering this group in Bosnia is called Victims, so in Bosnian žrtve, is because that is the term of the wider international transitional justice community that was simply adopted. And that is also the term that is used in court. And when I was doing research for this book, I was intrigued to see that, for example, when you study cases of child slavery, and if you study cases of child sexual abuse, even in the United States, the term victim, because it's being used in the court proceedings, then translates into the actual survivors adopting this term when they are in the court. Although outside of the court, they would maybe refer to themselves as survivors, within the court, because they understand in a way that the lingo of the field of what they're doing, they would start using the term victims. So it was interesting that during the interviews, a lot of the actual survivors would I'd say majority of them would actually call themselves victims. There were only a few that would actually get into this discussion regarding survivors. And the reason being is that since 1995, they have simply been referred to by the peace building community as victims, because that was the term of the day. That was the international community's slang, if you like. That has been the transitional justice terms. That has only recently, I don't know, the past 5-10 years, actually, maybe 10 years, has been challenged through this passive active discussion. So that is one example. And the other one is you definitely see that despite the fact that a lot of moral authority is being attributed to these groups, a good example that then will lead me to Sanjay's question is survivors of the Srebrenica genocide as being, the beacons of suffering for the Bosniak nation, basically being hijacked for any political campaign of the main nationalist party in Bosnia, of the Bosniaks, so the SDA, the Party of Democratic Action. Although they are being manipulated by this political party, they in a way do buy into this. And a lot of these organizations, there's a variety. These associations are by no means uniform. There are some of them that are resisting this, they don't want to have anything to do with this, but the main one in particular is certainly playing on this card, and would refer to themselves as the biggest victims, as the representatives of the Bosniak suffering, and the like, basically buying into this political narrative that was first given to them, if you like. So I think these two, it's a great question, because these two, exactly that's what I'm trying to say. A lot of it is attributed, but actually a lot of it is also influenced by how especially the leaders of the groups then engage with it, play with it, morph it, mold it to their own convenience. And I think this is extremely, how to say that, it's when you talk about transitional justice, when you talk about victims literature, it's inconvenient. Some people don't want to talk about this. Some people don't really want to look at victims as being political actors, because they have suffered a lot, and no one's taking the suffering away from them, obviously. No one's taking the traumas away from them. What we need to realize, though, is that they have become political actors with an important function in post-conflict states, and we shouldn't be shying away from it, I think. So to Sanjay's question, so I don't know the Sri Lankan case that well, so I'm not able to necessarily comment on the failure and whether that's because the associations of the families of missing people have not, organized themselves, or whether the ICMP has not been as supportive of of them as it was in other cases, as it has been across Latin America and across the Middle East, as well as Southeast Europe. But in terms of your question of the success, so the main success, how I define it, is what did the group want and what did it achieve in terms of the legal adoption right? So in the case of Bosnia, we had this group of missing people that was mainly represented initially by the Srebrenica survivors, so the women whose husbands were taken away, husbands, sons, and the likes, all the males basically taken away, who organized themselves in associations and who started pushing for a series of rights, rights of burial, having a commemoration site, various benefits for their children, various benefits for them regarding houses, return to houses, as well as material compensation, and the fact that they are basically recognized in law as families of missing people rather than families of deceased, because they didn't want to declare their families, their husbands and family relatives as deceased, as dead, until their bodies were found. And to have the right, obviously, to search for their bodies, to get all the information about their bodies and so on. And this is what they demanded. And really, the law that was adopted in Bosnia in 2004, on paper, it states most of these things, all of these things, basically. It's the law on paper is excellent. It created a new institution. It created on paper a new victims fund. It gave the families a series of rights regarding the burial, and the likes, and the likes, and the likes. And it created a new register for all those who went missing. And as I said, those numbers are fairly accurate. When I talk about success, it's the success of adoption. So this law was adopted in 2004. It was a great success that it was adopted at that time. The implementation of it, because of the varieties and complexities of the Bosnian state, has been pretty poor. And so only parts of it were adopted. So a new institution was created. The register is now basically verified and underway. The Victims Fund has never really been created because they simply can't agree on things such as where the seat is going to be, how it's going to be funded, and the likes and the likes. The classic kind of nitty-gritty politics of divided states. But in terms of the adoption, which is what I'm looking at, how did they even manage to push this through under those circumstances? It was a success. So this is how I look at success. It's not the greatest term, and I could have probably called it differently. But if you look at their demands and if you look at what was adopted on paper, they were very successful in that respect.
Great. Thank you, Jessie.
Thank you. Are there other questions? Otherwise, we have...
Katerina has a few impressions.
Right, I didn't see that. Yes, so we could start with Katerina and then we'll have Claudia.
Okay, hi everyone. So I worked in Bosnia as a human rights officer at the OSCE for 3 years, so between 2016 and 2019. And the last 2 years I was in the field in the area of Tuzla, Srebrenica, Zvornik, Bijeljina, so one of the hotspots of the war. And I worked a lot. Right now we don't do that much in the field. I worked a lot on reports, on the access, not from a legislative perspective. I'm not a lawyer, but more from the human rights perspective. So on the access to social benefits, especially from civilian victims of war, as they're called in Bosnia. And as Jessie said right now, we were looking at the different levels between the various entities and cantons. So some people are taking advantage of these different levels. At the same time, the authorities are forcing a lot to have different levels. And also we were looking at the problem of the implementation. So amazing laws on papers, and then out there nothing happens. So something that I heard already right now, and I think it's very important, I conducted a series of interviews with Association of Victims of Torture in the area. And if the victims of sexual violence and families of missing persons have some access to rights, victims of torture are not recognized by any law, nor at the state, nor neither at the entity level. So they're like the underdogs of the underdogs, if you want to call it that way. And they still have a lot of issues with stigma, especially male victims of sexual violence. But another problem, and that was mentioned a few minutes before, is that smaller associations often don't recognize themselves in the activities of the bigger association, because bigger associations are politicized. Maybe they're not from the same ethnic background. So I don't know, like Croat victims of sexual violence don't want to be part of So the impression I had is that still many people feel left behind. And that was especially for the case of Brčko. So in 2018, finally, they founded a commission to assess the victims of sexual violence. But a lot of women did not show up because the doctor that was going to examine them was coming from Banja Luka, and they didn't want to take part with the whole thing, which goes against the law that you mentioned before, which was very proactive in protecting women. And one of the impressions I had is that there was a huge expectation both from the international community and the local community, because in the Dayton Peace Agreement, it's stated that victims should be given financial compensation. And this never happened because there is no money. So I had the impression that a lot of things were done in the right way, and there is an actual success in the laws and on paper that clashes with a reality that it's completely different.
Can I react, Dana? Because I think what Katerina is saying is exactly even like the reason why I did this research, because yes, it's spot on. So just a few comments on the victims of torture. 100%. When I started, what you're saying is 100% right. They're the underdogs. They had never been recognized. The only success when I was finishing the research is that in 2018, hallelujah, they actually are, as of 2018, recognized in Republika Srpska. So they are now actually drawing, the benefits are minimal. It's teeny tiny, but at least, the symbolic recognition is there within Republika Srpska. And that is extremely political. Basically, Dodik needed them as his, political support. And it's an extremely politicized organization that has always, their leaders have always been extremely close to the government. So that has slightly changed, but it has not changed anything on the federation side, where victims of torture are not recognized. It's an extremely politicized issue. Their latest leader he was arrested in December 2019 for corruption charges. He was basically running the Srebrenica Museum in Sarajevo and another one, selling tickets for triple the price and the likes. He was arrested, prosecuted. So, it's a very nasty story, what has been happening with the victims of torture. The leaders have been extremely politicized, and the individual members across the country have been the ones that have taken the brunt of the suffering. And not only the fact that they have not been symbolically recognized, but the fact that also materially they haven't really been able to claim benefits. I say that with the caveat, and I haven't talked about that, and I'm glad that you mentioned, Katerina, is that because there are these different groups, and a lot of people would pertain to various groups. So if we talk about military victims, a lot of the times they would also be victims of torture at the same time. So at least some individuals are sometimes able to draw benefits from like the different pot of the social benefit category. So, for example, the veteran laws were amended over the summer last year. So now you have more victims of torture within the federation being able to draw more on the military benefits than you would have in the past during the time you were there, 2016, 2018. So now, some things have changed, but it's minimal and it's basically case by case basis. On the case of, the beautiful laws on paper and implementation not really happening 100%, as I said, I didn't want to focus on that as much in this presentation. It is in the book that there's a huge disparity in terms of the politics of the implementation. Victims of sexual violence are, again, a great example of how women go through these interviews to be screened, to then be given the status, and why some women are rejected if they support this political party or they don't support this political party. Again, it's an extremely political story. On Brčko, I will admit that I make, I should have said that in the beginning, because Brčko is distinct within the bureaucracy of Bosnia, within the administrative system. I did not actually study Brčko. I did do interviews in Brčko, but I did not kind of include it in the variation because it has been an international, what is it called? Laboratory, if you like, an international laboratory of how to adopt certain laws. It has pertained to a slightly different variation of how things get done in Brčko. But it is absolutely the case that the Logoraši, the Victims of Torture organization in Brčko, again, is suffering hugely, but they do not pertain to any of the federation laws. So the law that I was talking about, the 2006 law in the federation, that does not apply to Brčko, because Brčko applies to, they actually have some executive orders. They don't even have laws for victims whatsoever. They only have these executive orders. Some of them exist, some of them are being implemented, but not much, to be honest. And there is a huge victim population there. As we know, the war there was pretty gruesome. So that's just, but thank you so much. Those are great interventions.
Thank you. Claudia had a hand up earlier. Maybe the question, which was, there she is, yeah.
I would still be happy if I can. Thank you. Thanks for the great talk. I have the question, whether and to which degree you would think that your framework can also travel to ongoing conflicts, and whether you would be aware, like maybe of a positive example where victims reached some goals during conflict.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Yes, I think so. I don't want to, as someone who doesn't do quantitative research, I'm always, I don't want to overextend the cases. I don't want to overgeneralize, but I'm fairly certain that beyond your question, which I will get to in a second, one could also use this framework to a different transitional justice area, to a different measure. One could probably use this for even a truth commission, although it does pertain to a slightly different set of considerations, but it could be adjusted. But I think one could think about the Yazidi women, for example. One could think about their campaigns, that the way that they have been prominent on the UN platform, the way that they've organized online, the way that they have used social media. And I think the Yazidi question, and they have organized themselves in this Yazda organization, is a good example where I think this could be applied. Obviously, where it's not going to apply is that within conflict, the domestic political dynamics is different. So this whole framework is based on the fact that, the conflict is over. There's a certain level of pluralization in the society. So domestic authorities are listening to their citizens and to their pressure groups, to their social groups. And they're listening to the international kind of demands, and on the basis of that are adopting new policies. That is in a way the mechanism of change. This is how we shift from no to yes. So that would have to be adjusted as well. But the wider idea of victim capital, I think, is still valid. We don't talk about it. I have a colleague in the US who has done some brilliant work on the Roma and Sinti communities, victims, Claire Greenstein. And she just published a great article in the International Journal for Transitional Justice, if you want to check it out. And she really is looking at this idea of, why have Jewish communities been so successful with their redress? I mean, she talks about reparations. To me, it's a set of redress rights. And why have Sinti and Roma communities not been? Well, because they don't really have any victim capital, what I call victim capital, and she theorizes it slightly differently. She focuses a lot more on the mobilization aspect of it, on their organizations and the likes. But it's a very similar argument. So yes, I think we can see pathways in some of the victim groups, and especially regarding the sexual violence, and the Yazidi women are a great example. However, one would have to adjust quite a lot of the mechanisms of how change actually happens at the end of the day. Thank you.
Thank you. Nicolina had a question.
Yes, hello, hi. Apologies that my camera is off. I'm just at my home office is a little bit messy, so prefer to keep it this way for now. Just thank you very much for this presentation. It's been really interesting. I found it particularly interesting what you mentioned at the end in regards to the involvement of these victims organizations in politics, basically politicizing the victimhood, especially after the war. And so I wanted to ask, how does this involvement with politics, either, being used by the political parties, the nationalistic, specifically ethno-nationalistic political parties, and also the involvement of the victims in the politics. And, you mentioned also some of them founding these nationalistic parties. How does this affect particularly the victim capital, or more concretely the moral authority within that?
Great question. Yes, I do have a section on that. So again, if I talk you, thank you. That's a brilliant question. So again, victims of torture. What has basically happened is that their politicization has brought down their moral authority dramatically. So I mentioned the case of the leader of one of these organizations who's now or I think he might have already been, apologies, I'm a bit out of date. I have a three-week-old newborn at home, so my life has been slightly turned upside down. So I'm not sure if he's still being prosecuted, if he's still already in jail, what is actually happening. But basically, he is an extremely corrupt individual that a lot of the victims that I talked about were complaining about. And ultimately, he did end up being prosecuted. And the story you hear from the media is that, victims of torture, fine. I mean, poor people. However, they're so politicized. They're so close to the political parties that whatever they need, they can just extend their hand, and the leaders get the money directly from the political parties. And in a lot of the cases in Republika Srpska, that's exactly what was happening, or is still the case. In the Federation, it really depended who the leader was, but the founding leaders of both of these the key organizations were also founding members of the nationalist political parties. So, a lot of them would be members of the parliaments representing those parties, and at the same time leading these associations. It doesn't mean that a political actor can't be a victim at the same time. These people did go through camps. They did go through torture. What it means, though, is that it brings down their moral authority because people are no longer looking at them as innocent victims, as clean hand victims, as people who are simply demanding their rights. They're looking at them as profiteers, not as war profiteers, but as post-war profiteers. And that really has affected how this group has been portrayed. And part of the argument, I'd say, why victims of torture have not been recognized is precisely this, because they have been perceived as so politicized and as so close to the political parties that, why would we actually do this for them when, they're already part of the political structures and they're so close to the authorities. If they want a new law, they can lobby themselves for it, is the argument. What is obviously missing in this is that there's a huge discrepancy across the country between the leaders of the victim associations, especially the big, dominant and prominent victim associations, and the members. Some of the small local victim associations are wonderful and, they're trying to do their best, but their mobilization resources are close to nil. But the bigger players, like Madrasa Srebrenica, for example, and JEPA, there's a huge discrepancy in terms of what the members get and what the leaders get, and how the leaders engage with politics. So that you're absolutely right.
Thank you. I'm going to abuse my position to ask a question that actually leads on from that. And it was about the concept of victim capital, the moral authority, the international salience, and the mobilization resources. I think that question boils down to sort of asking which aspect of these is particular to victims, to the fact that these are victims, because it's the example that keeps coming to my mind when I hear about the issues of redress and the politicization and the battles that are going on about these laws in Bosnia is actually the politics of what we see also in the former Yugoslavia and in many other contexts of veterans associations, right? And then this brought me back to the point that you made, that you actually do count military victims. So if you could expand a little bit on this, because and to sort of tease out is this actually a story of not so much victim capital, but conflict capital, sort of conflict legacy capital, whether it's from the perpetrator, veteran, activist, or victim side, or what is specific about victim? Because particularly moral authority surely has an equally divisive and powerful dimension on the veteran side.
No, you're absolutely. So let me just take a step back. So the reason why I talk about military victims is that, as we know, in a lot of conflicts, young soldiers, young men get drafted without their own willingness. And so they, in a way, become victims and / veterans, and then might become perpetrators themselves of certain crimes. And it is extremely difficult to actually say that, one is a victim, one is a veteran, one is a perpetrator, one is a victim, one is a civilian, one belongs to the military. It's a bit of a Venn diagram. Some of them are, where basically the Venn diagram crosses itself. Some of them are clearly civilian, some of them are clearly military. In the Bosnian case, the way the social policies have been designed is that civilian war victims are directly dependent on what military war victims get. So if someone is deemed 60% disabled veteran and gets this amount of money, then civilian war victims of the same injury gets a proportion of that money, a lower proportion of that money. And they are part of the same justification of resources and suffering, which is in a way done in the same way as any other social policy would be done, which is on the basis of needs rather than rights. It's on the basis of, how much have you been injured? And then it is skewed for the civilians because there's this veteran bonus basically given to the military saying, oh, and on top of that you fought, so we will give you a little bit more, or actually quite a lot more. So that's why I had to include the military war victims, because without them, the whole kind of program of redress benefits would be incomplete in the Bosnian case. I believe in most cases it's quite similar, but not necessarily. Every case will be slightly different, and it will have to be up to the individual researcher to kind of decide whether to include them or not. If we have cases like Uganda, one could argue that a lot of child soldiers are basically victims. Are they perpetrators or are they victims? Things like this need to be considered. To the question of victim capital or conflict capital, so I think there is a distinction between saying that, if you survived any war, you are a victim, and which would be conflict capital in various shades of it, to saying, I lost my legs, I was sexually violated, I was kept in a camp, or I was, on the battlefield and then stepped on a mine and lost my legs. And so it is really related, and that is also the way that it's being, the policies are being adopted. It's really related to the idea of suffering, harms, injuries, and less so kind of psychological consequences, PTSD and the likes. That's a recent development that really has not been part of the initial thought process. So the victim capital is really more linked to this. In the wider literature on reparations, is what is in a way like an appropriate measure to repair, to heal, that would be proportionate, and that's the term, proportionate to the suffering of these individuals. So one could probably have a scale of veteran/victim capital from, low suffering to very high suffering, and then try to adjust it as a continuum as well. I could have called this differently, but I do think that there is this victimization, this idea of being victimized means that something has happened to you that is not necessarily the same as to the rest of the population that has survived the war and might have gone through the same conflict. You might have lived in Sarajevo during the siege in the same way, but has not lost, his or her child has not lost legs, has not been sexually violated in Grbavica, and so on. So that's where the moral authority kind of comes in place as well, and the idea of clean hand victims. The rest of them, the international Salience and the Mobilization Resources, one could argue that, a lot of social groups would have similar ones, and it wouldn't necessarily be victim capital. But the moral authority is quite distinct for the victim population, and this is why then it leads me to the wider idea of victim capital.
Thank you very much. We have time for a short final question. The quickest was Leandra, so I'll give you the last question.
Thank you. I have trained this. Right, my last question would then be, what about when victims are not allowed to be victims in the context of male victims of sexual violence? And I relate this to the Croatian case that I know more about, and where apparently it's the first country that actually in the reparation mechanism explicitly mentions male victims and is ready to give compensation, and where we just now have a new Minister of Defense who says soldiers cannot be raped. Have you come across this kind of taboo that has actually decreased their capital?
Yeah, so the case of male victims, and Janine Kalari has done a lot of research on this. I haven't actually interviewed male victims of sexual violence, mainly because it's so stigmatized that it's really hard to encounter them. They exist, obviously, but they're not that willing to talk out about their experiences. And a lot of them would refer to themselves as victims of torture rather than victims of sexual violence, mainly because we're still talking about, let's be honest, slightly more patriarchal societies where, the rape of men is simply emasculating. It's a lot of victims of torture themselves being kept in the camps feel that they have, not that they have deserved it, but that they are not men enough to have fought back, not to be kept in those camps. And on top of that, if they were violated, they simply do not want to talk about that. They would be willing to talk about the beatings, the starvations and the likes, but they would not talk about any sort of sexual violence because it is so stigmatized. So I have not encountered, the Croatian, I'm aware of the Croatian case and it is quite extreme, but Croatia in certain respects is even more extreme than Bosnia regarding these nationalist policies. But I have not encountered that from the side of the policymakers refusing male victims to be recognized as victims. And there are women victims of war, although it's a Women Victims of War is the name of the organization. They do have male members, and males have been recognized as victims of sexual violence. So we don't necessarily, I think, I might be wrong, but I don't think we necessarily have this problem of not being allowed. They are technically allowed, but a lot of them, my understanding is that there were something like a few hundred of them in the case of Bosnia. A lot of them just simply don't want to be. And the more time passes, I think the fewer instances of that we might end up having.
Thank you for these questions, and we do have to wrap up now because of time. So I want to thank especially Jessie for this very, very rich, your knowledge of all the laws and all the groups and all the districts and so on is really very impressive. So it's great to see the book out, and thank you so much for taking the time at this really very busy period to join us and to answer all of our questions. And thanks to everybody who took part. And hope to see you in Switzerland at some point in the future.
I will have to run. Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye. And thank you very much for questions. Bye.
Thank you so much.